So I think we're on listen only as well. Good.
So, hi everyone, we've got people are still joining us, so we're just going to hang on 1 minute before we do our intro. Great. I think most people are here. So, good afternoon everyone. I'm Nadine and I work for Treeconomics, and we would like to give you a warm welcome to everyone joining us today. In this webinar, Kenton Rogers from Treeconomics is going to be having a chat with Dan Vickridge from Torbay about their urban forest journey. Torbay is a coastal area in the southwest of England, and it includes Torquay, Brixham and Paignton, and it has an incredible treescape. And actually Torbay were the first local authority in the UK to carry out an iTree study back in 2011. So that's really exciting, and we're also joined by Dana from the Davy Resource Group in the US. Dana's going to be helping us with the Q&A session at the end. The Q&A session is where you can ask questions about anything you've heard today. So what I'm going to do is just point you to where you're going to put your questions, if you have any, which is you should have a side panel with a questions section. If you pop them in there, you can pop them in at any time, and we will get to them at the end. And if we don't get to them, we can always catch up with you afterwards. There's also a chat section in your side panel, and in here, feel free to tell us who you are and where you're from. And during the webinar, I will be putting some useful links in here, so keep an eye out for those. But before we start, we wanted to do a few polls. We know everyone loves polls, and we wanted to know who is here today. So I'm just going to launch that one. So just a few more seconds on that. Okay, I'm going to close that one. So we have 32% tree officers. We have 16% local authority professionals. We have 24% other, 21% consultants, and 8% academics. Thank you, everyone. That's really interesting. And the next poll, which is the last one, is have you ever heard of iTree? So this webinar, we'll be talking about iTree a little bit. So we're curious to know who here has heard of iTree. Brilliant. That's actually really encouraging. So half of you have heard of iTree, 18% haven't. Actually, half of you have heard of it, 33% have heard of it and have used it in their work, which is 83%. So that's amazing. And then 18% haven't heard of it. So hopefully by the end of today, you will know what it's all about. Thank you for that. So I'm going to hand over to Kenton and Dan by the fireside.
Hi, hello, and Nadine, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I believe so.
Great, okay, thanks. Hi, yes, I'm Kenton Rogers, co-founder of Treeconomics. We do urban forest management, iTree projects, and master plans, tree strategies, things like that. And thanks very much for joining us. This is a new format for us, and I hope we can get through the whole interview and get done before the homeowners come back. So I'm joined here by Dan Vickridge, who's the Green Infrastructure Manager for Torbay. And Torbay is a very special place for us because not only is it the site of the first iTree project in the UK back in 2011. We'll be talking about iTree a bit more as we go through. And it was also the first project for Treeconomics as well. So it was quite fitting that we have our first webinar interview here with Dan from Torbay. And actually, even further back than 2011, Torbay is the place where a certain John Davy learned horticulture learnt his trade in the gardens of Torbay before he set sail to the US of A. And in 1880, he set up a little company called Davy, which some of you may have heard of. It's actually, I think, is one of the largest tree care companies in the world now. So, however, without further ado, I'd like to ask Dan to introduce himself, and also to ask actually, well, why are you here, Dan? Not in a philosophical sense, but more around like, what got you into trees? Why trees? What, is it more of an academic or an on the tools kind of background?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to come and discuss Torbay's urban forest. Hopefully we can have a nice little walk and potentially a bathe as we go along and through it. But my role in trees, it started actually back in the early 90s. I won't bore you for too long with rose-tinted spectacles around it, but I literally kind of fell into it. I just needed a job for the summer, fell in with a local tree company, ended up dragging brash, chipping bits of wood, getting whipped around the face, sent into your local DIY centre to go and buy some sky hooks. All the pranks were played on you at that time. Really enjoyed it in a perverse kind of way. Signed myself up for a college 3-year course, a couple of qualifications out of that. Finished that in the mid-90s. Headed out into the big wide world as a climbing arborist for the next 4 or 5 years, continuing just with CPD really on the way through, keeping myself up to date. And then I actually had an opportunity to join Torbay Council late 1999, early 2000, as one of the Torbay went unitary at that point. So not only did we have the full tree asset urban forest scenario, we also had the planning function to look after and also the woodlands. So there were 3 tree officers at that time, but my role within that setup was around the planning function and fulfilling that. And by choice, that only lasted for about 18 months. From my point of view, I was given an opportunity to go and manage them, one of the local companies. So I left there, went and managed this company for a certain amount of years. And then I had another opportunity to start on my own. So I actually had my own small contracting business. And that, as I got older, and less wanting to keep climbing trees, it was very much a case of just migrating, continuing with the CPD throughout, just migrating into becoming a consulting arborist. And so for the last, up until this point, since 2010 actually, I worked for primarily 2 companies in mid-Devon, providing that full range of services from BS 5837 development sites, climbing assessments on trees, individual tree inspections, large-scale tree assessments, risk assessments on trees, and rounding out a whole another piece of knowledge that I needed. And then 2019 came along, and while I was still working for these companies, Torbay Council came a calling again. Their tree officer had just left. They needed a gap to fill prior to the recruitment phase going through. So I stepped in there again, back to where I was 20 years ago, fulfilling the planning function with a colleague who had the probably more exciting bit in terms of the urban forestry management piece. And that just ran through. Then obviously COVID hit, so we were retained there. And then I actually worked for a company called Swissco. So it's wholly owned by Torbay Council. Swissco provides services to do with highways and waste, street scene, grounds and maintenance, parks and green infrastructure. And the role was out for recruitment, the tree officer role. So I actually joined Swissco as opposed to Torbay Council, but we sit under the wider Torbay Council umbrella. And then just by nature of the being and Swissco itself, with the advent of BNG, my remit was changed to include green infrastructure. And so my role now is just it's a broader concept now, but fundamentally it's still very much around the urban forest of Torbay.
Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting how many people working in arboriculture as tree managers, tree officers have come through on the tools. It's quite common.
Yeah, I think that story may resonate with a few people. I don't know the demographics of people who have turned up, but it may resonate with a few of them in terms of that journey.
Yeah. And what do you find most of your time is spent doing in your day-to-day role now? Because I know back in 2011, the tree officer role in Torbay, and I know you weren't in post then, it was very much about managing individual trees. And what we're finding more and more now is it's more about that more holistic environment. The urban forest.
Certainly. I mean, the role of the tree officer, number one, it's fundamental, it's key, it's absolutely vital. If you have an urban forest, you certainly need someone who knows what they're looking at, both as an individual basis, as you've already alluded to, in terms of the tree management, but that higher level strategic approach in terms of what have we got across our whole area, no matter how small or big it is, and what's the best for that. But one of the other fundamental parts that I found, I've only been in post now for about 3 years, and that is, although that is a large part of their role and that there's an accepted amount of knowledge you need to have to do that, fundamentally you also have to deal with the public and manage their expectations around that and meet them. And it's almost an education piece in that respect. So they'll be opening their curtains every morning, looking at the large lime trees, glaring at them. Yeah. And they've got concerns about that tree and whether it's going to fall over or not. But then also we have to take into account how we look after all our trees throughout the bay strategically, and what's the best way of doing that, preserve, enhance and promote the urban forest itself.
So wider landscape.
Yeah, it's a multifaceted role.
Yeah,
it's absolutely key and vital in terms of determining and ensuring that your urban forest is successful going forwards.
Great. Sorry, I forgot to mention, actually, do ask questions as we go along in the chat function. And Dana, has anyone posted any questions as yet?
Mostly people are talking about where they're from, but we'll keep looking to make sure. There's some people who actually have used iTree, and some people, there's somebody here who's going to do a project this summer. So that's great.
Fantastic. iTree is, because Torbay was the first place to do iTree, I suppose for the folks that haven't heard of it, iTree is a free-to-use urban forest assessment tool that tells you, essentially by way of doing a survey of your urban forest, sample-based, or using an existing tree inventory, you can get a really good handle on the structure. So what trees have you got, how big are they, and the composition, what tree species do you have in what proportions, and then the functions. So what are the trees doing, how much air pollution are they filtering, how much stormwater are they holding up in their canopies, that kind of thing, but also the values. And I think that the values are only a small part of iTree, but that's often what gets the headlines, the values. That, Torbay's trees, I remember when that first came out, £250 million worth of asset being managed, and on top of that, the annual amounts as well. So you came in after the first iTree survey, but how have you been using the results in your day-to-day work? And did you want to say a bit more about the resurvey that was done 10 years later?
So essentially I'm just trying to build on work. The great work's already been done by my predecessors. So Torbay had the foresight, or the tree officers at the time had the foresight to think, okay, let's give this iTree a whirl and just see where we end up with it. So it's the first one ran, extremely grateful, and it cranked out some great figures. So the 21 survey used, because Torbay was essentially, I think, split into 254 squares. I think it was 250 squares approximately.
Yeah, and a plot in each one.
Yeah, and there was a plot in each one. So it's what we did for the 21 survey was replicate the 2010 survey. So we had existing data which we pulled in and actually sped the process up. And despite a few changes in methodology around how we surveyed the trees, we've essentially got as close as we can get a comparative set of data from the last one. So at the high level, one of the key aspects is obviously canopy cover.
Yeah.
So the canopy cover back in 2010, 2011 was 11.8, I think it was from memory. We've gone up to 18.2%, which is a significant increase. But that's against the backdrop of over 200,000 trees being lost in that 10-year period, which is an astonishing amount of trees in Torbay to be lost. So there's a little bit of head scratching around that apparent anomaly within the figures. But when you start digging into a little bit further, we found that there are a number of reasons why. There was just the obvious loss of trees in the urban landscape as a matter of course, whether it be in the public realm or in private gardens.
So things like development, old age.
Yeah, exactly. Just the natural ebb and flow of trees being put in or taken out. The next one was the methodology. So for this one, Forest Research required us to almost comply with their protocols in terms of what was classified as a tree as opposed to a shrub.
Yeah, and they're across the whole of Europe actually. Those protocols are forest protocols. So in iTree, when we did the first one, I think it was every tree over an inch was recorded, or 2.5 centimeters. And for After Torbay, everything moved to 7 centimetres and above was recorded as a tree. Yeah, to tie in with all the forestry mensuration.
Exactly that. So, I mean, so that skewed the figure somewhat, and obviously trees that may have been classed as trees were not now trees; they were shrubs or classed as the understory or whatever layer it is. We also have, and then on top of that as well, our post 2010, a lot of the woodlands were thinned quite extensively. Up 20–30% thinning regimes were carried out and completed. And if you actually look at the number of trees per hectare we now have in 21, as opposed to 2010. So in 2010, we had just over 100 trees per hectare, and now we're down at 70. So that would reflect that thinning regime, I suspect.
Yeah, because you're going thin to about 30%.
Yeah, exactly that. And as what has happened in the meantime, is what it shows us is that that canopy cover in those woodlands has closed over, and a lot of the large trees that are still in the bay have continued to grow massively, so they're doing really well. So on the canopy cover side and on the tree loss side, we can account for that. But going back to your comment around numbers and evaluation, that the pounds and pence are actually quite key, because although to an outsider, maybe the green fluffy stuff that aren't trees great, but how do you quantify that? And what does it mean when you say, well, can we invest a bit more money in our urban forest because it's worth a bit? And people come back and say, well, how do you know it's worth a bit? And most of us will know observationally and in our guts that actually, or intuitively, that, yeah, look, it is worth, it's got to be worth something surely. But now we've got the data, and the figures on iTree2, when they ran into, they're quite significant. So if you take the CAVAT evaluation, which is a new introduction, so we don't have it for 2010, it came just over 4 billion, and it's a significant amount of money. And even if you look at the CTLA figure, that drops over 300 million pounds. So as soon as you start asking, please can I have a few more £1,000 to spend on this asset? Well, what's in it for us? As well, look, we've got a whole raft of documentation here that actually states, yes, it's public and private trees, but nevertheless, it's a hell of an asset to have and look after and manage. So would you mind just giving us a bit more money? Obviously, that's against the backdrop of a local authority and competing demands from other areas such as social services and housing. So you're always slightly up against it, but unless you're in a strong position, if you have that evidence base to take it forward.
It gives you that background sort of resource valuation that is often missing. And so just to clarify, the CTLA is the Council of Tree and Landscape Appraisers, and it's a formula that gives a replacement cost, and that is calculated within iTree. It's what it would cost you to replace a tree, even though that tree might be 30 meters tall. If it's removed, you're going to have to replace it and then wait for that tree to grow. So it gives you a value for that, the replacement cost. CAVAT is unique to the UK, and that's the capital asset valuation for amenity trees, and that provides an amenity value. So what is that tree worth as an amenity? And so, for example, a beautiful tree in a park that everyone sees will have a much higher value than a tree that is on private property and no one sees. And that's why there's that huge disparity between those two figures of, what was it for the CAVAT? Sorry, did you?
Oh, CAVAT, so 4.1 billion it comes out. Yeah. I mean, let's point out, I mean, Torbay is quite densely populated. And a lot of the trees are highly visible, and on I think it's the CTI valuation in CAVAT, we sit at 125% because of the visibility of multiple people to our tree asset. So it sits quite high, so that definitely elevates the figures. But Torbay as a whole is 125% on the CTI.
Kenton, we've got a couple questions in the chat that are really good and kind of apropos to what you guys are talking about right now. So the first thing I do want to say is that there are links in the chat, some useful links in the chat, iTree, some reports and things like that. So don't forget to go there if you want to look at some of the things that these two are talking about. But the first question that someone asked, and this is kind of an age-old question, how accurate is iTree when used in Europe? So that's the first one, and then so talk about that one and then come back to me for the second one, okay?
Okay. Do you want me to take that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So when we did iTree in Torbay in 2011. It was untested in the UK, and we worked with Natural England and the UK Forest Research, who are the research arm of the UK's Forestry Commission, similar to the USDA Forest Service research. And we worked hard to make sure that, to find out actually, was iTree applicable to the UK? Did it provide meaningful results? And was it accurate? And so fortunately, we found that it did provide the results we needed. We could use UK pollution data, we could use UK meteorological data, and that's in the model. But talking about the accuracy of iTree, it is a sampling approach. So, for example, in Torbay, 250 plots, they're an acre each, or 0.04 of a hectare each, these plots. And when you extrapolate that to the whole land area of Torbay, which is a little over 6,000 hectares or square, it's not a big area of land. And that's one of the limitations with sampling. It's as accurate as you make it. We could have put a lot more plots in, but that would have been a lot more expensive, and we wouldn't have seen a lot more accuracy from our efforts, despite all that extra input, if that makes sense. And so it can be as accurate as you want it, but what we found working in the UK is 250 plots gives you a good idea, good standard error to work with for its purpose, which is looking at the entire urban forest. So I hope that answers your question. And we've got papers on this, so we can add those into the resources after the webinar as well.
That's really good, because the follow-up question to this one is, what size sample works? And I know what those calculations are. I did those about 2 weeks ago for a client, but definitely what size sample works. And then if you haven't got a tree inventory to work with, what is the best way to gather the data to produce a meaningful tree assessment? So those are sort of the same kind of question there. I'll let you take it.
Thanks, Dana. So, I mean, Torbay, you're lucky. You've got a tree inventory.
Yes, we've had it for a while. We've had it since the early 2000s. It's robust. We've got historical data dating back. I mean, we always come across gaps with trees that are Torbay Council owned, but I would suggest the significant proportion of the trees that are owned by Torbay Council are on that database.
Yeah.
So we've got a robust starting point from our point of view.
That's good, because if you've got a tree inventory, you can run that through iTree, and it will give you results on your street tree population or the trees you're managing, maybe in a park as well, or across an arboretum site maybe. But if you haven't got any data, then short of actually going out and doing a tree inventory, which I think is really important, you can't manage what you haven't measured. But I know of some places, not Torbay, because they just went in and did the sample survey straight away. But there's been other places where they've used iTree Canopy, and this is a system that works on the fly with Google Maps. You can go in and probably on a morning, over the course of a morning, you can self-teach yourself and get a really good idea of tree canopy cover and the ecosystem services or benefits provided by that canopy across a project area, and that can help you lever funding for the next step. Once you're armed with something to say, well, the trees in our neighborhood or in our town, that we have 20% canopy cover and everywhere around us is at 30, or we now need to ask more questions and get the conversation started, and then that can lead to a more in-depth sample survey or tree inventory study.
That's good. It's very interesting, because the follow-up part of this question is, would it be better to focus on the urban areas within, or with a mix of urban and rural? And to me, that's a very interesting question, because so many, places where we are in America that, that mix of urban and rural is what the urban forest is. So, what about you guys? What does that mean for you guys?
I would think primarily because of the ecosystem's benefits associated with having the trees, you'd probably concentrate initially on those urban areas and all the benefits that would bring with climate change adaptation coming through, or whatever. So, and then rainwater runoff, increased storm events. So I'd probably look to concentrate on the urban area and just see what the relevance and importance of the trees are there before you migrate out into those wider agricultural areas where those benefits may not be so keenly felt. Because obviously you've got the urban heat island going on in the urban areas as well, with large canopy trees. We don't have what I think the Americans would call shade trees over here at the moment, but I suspect with climate change and increasing temperatures, we may refer to them more readily as such as time goes by. So I'd probably certainly, just from that point of view, concentrate on the urban areas.
That's great. Thank you for that. It's very different in very different places. And I continually say to clients and to cities and to communities that no two urban forests are alike. And so you kind of have to manage what you have. And one of the questions is here, if you don't have a tree inventory to work with, what's the best way to gather the data to produce a meaningful iTree assessment? And I think you've kind of answered that, but how do you go about getting sample data? What's the way that you do that?
So you're right if I answer this one?
Yeah, you carry
on. So I'll take Torbay as an example. We did the sample survey, and we took the urban forest to mean, it's the whole political boundary of Torbay, but it was everywhere. The urban forest is everywhere. And so it was trees in public and private ownership that were surveyed in urban and more rural areas as well. But we scattered our plots over the whole area, and we gridded it up. So it was an even spread, but actually some other studies have looked at it slightly differently and said, well, we do want to know more about our urban areas. So they might put more of their plots in the areas that they want to find out more about. So they'll put 70% of their plots in the urban areas and just 30 in the wider environment. And I guess it depends what you want to know and how you're defining the urban forest and what you're going to do with the results, because that will inform how you do the survey. But in Torbay, yeah, we did 250 plots randomly allocated, irrespective of public and private ownership, to get an overall snapshot. And actually thinking about the urban forest rather than just trees, because you've got areas of grass and unmaintained grass, scrubland, parks, open water. And actually in the more recent survey in 2021, we did a baseline assessment on Torbay's underwater urban forest. So Torbay's a coastal town, it's right next to the sea, and there's a lot of seagrass beds out in the bay, and they're actually doing a great job of storing carbon.
Yeah, very much. I mean, like you say, it's a recent thing for us, certainly. And seagrass has obviously been around for a long time. In terms of being in the public conscious, slightly more recent. It was a great addition to the iTree survey this time round. So Wild Planet Trust, I think, had a great bit of input around that for us. We've got some rough bit of mapping about where it sits. Being the coastal resort that it is, obviously there's pressures on it from tourism and the use of water in and around, obviously in the sea there, with boating, jet skis and the like. And also we've got an operating fishing port as well, just around the corner. So the pressure in and around that seagrass environment is quite large, but I know there are plans afoot, certainly internally within Torbay Council and some external groups, to kind of form a cogent cohort, if you like, to start looking at the seagrass properly, certainly with a view to protecting it, enhancing it and conserving it for future. So that's on the back burner, and if I can get rid of the green bit out of my moniker and put blue on there, then I can get involved in it as well. So that'd be great.
We'll do some scuba diving.
Yeah, that'd be good fun.
Yeah, I did want to mention that because it goes a bit beyond iTree, but it's still the urban forest. But also what's great about iTree is you can bolt this other stuff onto it as well. Like the cavat wasn't originally part of iTree, but I think every iTree project we do now, we're asked to provide the cavat values as well, and you can get the data in and out of iTree really easily and use it with other tools and models. And yeah, that seagrass thing, we didn't know a lot. There was just some empirical data on the areas and some values from the literature on what carbon storage is. And of course you get the questions then, well, how do you know this? And what about this? And what about that? And that can lead then to, well, we need funding to look at those things.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, the iTree project in and of itself is just this large holistic overview, this high level of what have we got? What's the tree stock, both terrestrial and now in the water, and it all just comes together holistically in terms of how we look after and manage and what we can do. What is the funding we're going to need to progress this? And that is just that evidence base again. I'll keep reiterating it. If you've got that, it just makes your position so much stronger. Then you can have this intuitive knowledge about what you should be doing. But if you've got the evidence base, it's absolutely key.
Yeah, I think iTree gives you that baseline, and you can keep going back to it and see how you've progressed.
Yeah.
So Dana, were you about to say something?
I was, but it's an interesting statement and question both together that kind of talks about what you guys are talking about right now. So the person asked, would an iTree work to study a village in Southeast Mallorca? They need more trees for shade and to stop the removal for new build swimming pools, as there is no local policy. And the same person asks or makes a statement that Campos is an urban and rural with tourism and has huge shifts in population as agriculture dies. And I think that what that really is getting at is kind of like, what are those challenges that we're facing in urban forestry? And, when she mentions the swimming pool, we think of it, swimming pools or houses or, buildings or whatever it is that's getting in the way of the trees. And, that's a really good topic of conversation. And how does iTree help engage the community in those challenges of urban forestry?
Thanks, Dana.
Well, I mean, there's a whole gamut of challenges for urban forestry, but obviously one of the primary, well, there's a primary few really. So we've got climate change coming in, which would be one. Development, which I was going to talk about nationally, but obviously it's an international problem in terms of encroachment into whatever tree population we have, and then managing the people and the grey infrastructure, the roads and streets where we've got street trees and trees within the pavement areas as well. So the urbanisation, the encroachment of development, if we just take Torbay as an example, is that we don't have enough land in Torbay, full stop, wherever you build, to fulfil our requirements for housing. So potentially everything's under threat. The land, the soil, the hedgerows, the trees within the hedgerows, the plant life, the diversity around all of that. So we really do have to have strong and robust policies, which is referred to there, around how do we go about that. Now we've got some British standards around that, about how we try and manage that going forward. So there's certainly a pressure there in terms of it. But the climate change adaptation is, you're looking at species resilience around that, the ingress of different pests and diseases into the area. You've got the rise in temperature. I mean, it was on the news this morning, the 1.5 gone up over the year. We're potentially seeing different host species for different types of fungi than we're historically used to as well. We've got all of this coming through, urban heat island stuff. So the role of trees and what value you place on them and how you engage the community to look at them, you can use the iTree data and information as that education piece, that piece of paper to roll out and go, look, these are really important. We need to manage them. We kind of know what's coming. We know what we've got. There's a gap between where we might need to go with this, but you need to realise that actually that these trees form a fundamental part of what's coming through in the future.
Yeah, I agree completely, and I think one of the important things to bring out that as well is iTree is a tool that gives you a lot, and I mean it's a lot of data. We have like 70% reports that probably only output on 30% of what iTree can do, but iTree can't be like a shortcut to thinking, I suppose. That data that comes out of iTree, like it needs interpreting and turning into information that different people can understand and digest. So if you're doing a briefing report for a cabinet member or portfolio holder, you'll do something different than if you're speaking to your local community group, because they interact with the data in different ways. iTree has got it all there, but you need to interpret it and turn that data into information.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the key things that actually came out of this latest iTree was actually our age structure and what we've got. So we've got a large amount of mature, heading into over mature senescent trees. Where we've got the gap is down at the younger age. So in the meantime, with what's coming in terms of climate change and what we need, and those large canopy trees that are still performing, they're doing all the heavy lifting, but that time's ebbing towards an end. It's coming. So in terms of the ask around the pounds and the pence, the information out of that broadly from iTree is that we need to manage our existing tree stock as best we can, the large canopy stuff. In the meantime, where we've got the younger tree population established and growing, we need to provide an environment for them and improve that environment for them so they can fulfill their potential, whilst also targeting new planting where we can. But because Torbay, where it is, pressures from development, our existing canopy cover being absolutely spot on, then we need to target that planting. And it's not a case of plant by numbers, it's very much a case of right tree, right place. And identification of those areas. And so to that end, just to add on to the iTree thing, we actually had the mapping, the planting opportunity mapping done for us. And the criteria that fed into that was essentially pollution, living 10 meters from a road, flood risk, health, and deprivation were the 5 main factors that fed into it. And then we had a RAG rated map, essentially red, amber, green, divvied up into the wards of Torbay, so we could break it down a lot easier. So obviously where there's red on the map, we could go and have a look at that and see what if we could get anything in the ground or not. It wasn't always the case, and that piece of work is still ongoing. But that's kind of what prompted on from that initial review of the iTree data. Where do we need to go? Well, we need to start getting more trees in the ground. So that's the piece of work that's currently being undertaken.
Planting trees in the areas that need it.
Well, I think planting and making sure they get established. That aftercare piece is absolutely fundamental. We're trying to change it from a planting strategy to a tree establishment kind of strategy going forwards, because that first 3 to 5 years, especially in a coastal environment, is key.
Sorry, Dana.
I was going to say that really plays right into a question here, and I think you may have kind of answered it, but can you use iTree to identify gaps in canopy at a local level to prioritize planting?
You can, I guess, at a high level. I mean, if you download the iTree project, that you should be able to. It's got all our wards just done by canopy cover. So if you just look at that from a very broad, high level point of view, we can identify where we've got low canopy cover in a particular ward. And then we can go out and have that look. If we haven't done the detailed bit of analysis, we've got one ward in particular sits at 40% canopy cover, so we wouldn't bother going there. We've got some other wards down at 12 or 13, where maybe there's opportunity there. So from very high level, that's what we could kind of use that canopy data for, just as a starter for 10 almost.
Yeah, that's great. I think a canopy study is, obviously more accurate. Using different kind of imagery, but I think that iTree is a great start. iTree Canopy is a great start for that, for sure. You know, and going back to another thing that you guys were talking about in terms of climate change, we're doing a project in the States where there was an ice storm, and we already had data from prior 5 years ago with iTree Eco, where we did plots, and we're going to go back and redo those plots and look at the species definitely to see how they, you know, survived the ice storm and what happened afterwards, to do that kind of before and after study, which I think is a really unique way of using iTree as well. But going back to policy, there's a question in here. What are your thoughts on tree canopy policy being introduced locally? What with Cornwall Council introducing their tree canopy policy, whereby new developments require canopy coverage of 15% of the site area. Would this also be beneficial in Torbay policy also? So I think, you know, and taking that to an iTree level, could you use iTree to help monitor and manage that canopy?
I guess if you carry out repeated iTree studies or iTree canopy studies over a period of time, you could keep an eye on what the canopy cover is. In terms of the Cornwall one, it's one that we're keeping an eye on it. I don't know in depth. My colleague actually, the new senior tree officer, knows it quite well, and I need to speak to him about it because he knows the author of it. So we'll have a chat about that. I think that there probably will be some issues in how it plays out, but it'd be interesting to see how it turns out in trying to achieve that 15% across a new development.
Yeah, I can see it happening more and more. Interestingly, High Wycombe in Bedfordshire, is it High Wycombe? They were doing this as well a couple of years back, and they've put in policy to make sure that there's adequate canopy cover on new developments. And I think there's this context specific. So if that development is already in a neighborhood with high canopy cover, they don't have to deliver quite as much as if that development might be the other side of town where there's very low canopy cover. And just to go back about iTree canopy, you can use iTree canopy at the ward level, I think, to build a map, or maybe the neighborhood level, and it will give you a blanket canopy cover score, which is a really good first start. But for things like Torbay's tree planting opportunity mapping, you really need to start, when you're looking at individual tree canopies or maybe a development site, you really need to start looking at more precise mapping, sort of with a greater resolution, in order to pick up those tree canopies. You need something that can give you tree canopy cover to within sort of 50 centimeters or less to be able to police something like that. That's my thoughts anyway on that.
Great, thank you. There's also another question about canopy too, which seems to be a hot topic here. With regard to canopy cover, if the government can introduce legislation for biodiversity on new development sites, do you think there is scope for something similar with canopy coverage?
My answer is yes.
Yeah, I think there probably, I mean, it's just, where does it sit in terms of the competing interests for the use of the site? I think because depending on the size of the development, it's got to incorporate all sorts of, you could incorporate BNG on site, you can have player on site, amenity space on site, you're going to have basketball courts on site, you could have an orchard on site. Whether you could engineer canopy cover into there, ideally, yes, we could, because of the ecosystem benefits around that, but the MPPF actually relates to the introduction of street trees. So given the technology and the engineering solution nowadays in terms of the crate systems and the known soil volumes needed to ensure whatever's going in the street can planted will grow to its full maturity, there's an opportunity there, I think, potentially for ensuring that happens. There's a lever there within the MPPF going, okay, if we're not going to have trees there or in people's gardens, we'll have them in the street, and we'll without being too blunt, we'll have some money to look after them for X amount of years as well.
I think it's very context specific, isn't it? Depending on
so.
what the site's going to be used for and in which neighbourhood it is and what are the other factors there.
Yeah.
So iTree canopy, free tool canopy at ward neighbourhood level, actually there's a fairly new tool in the UK, and it's work from the Woodland Trust and American Forests, the tree equity score, and that's got again, it's another layer down, if you like, greater resolution, shows you tree canopy at postcode level, and with that it can highlight areas of where there's high social deprivation or health needs or air quality. And I think it's similar in the US, Dana. They have this very same website, and also doesn't iTree Landscape do the same thing?
Yes.
Or a similar thing, yeah. So you're able to, again, use these free tools to your best advantage before committing to, securing budget for something more local, I guess.
In canopy studies, as opposed to iTree, I mean, the two can be used together, obviously. But I think the thing about iTree, and I'm kind of going to go back to the roots, no pun intended, of this conversation, is a tool that allows you to share the value and the data of your urban forest in a variety of ways. And one of the challenges with canopy studies and political entities is that those canopy goals can sometimes just be made on a whim without the opportunity to determine if you have the room to plant the trees. And so along the same lines, there's a question here that's not really an iTree question, but would a requirement for a certain canopy coverage not incentivize development where it is already existing woodland, and therefore have the effect of fewer trees overall, as trees will be removed? And I think that goes to the political part of canopy studies in a lot of ways. And so I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And what would you do differently if you were developing in a woodland? And how would you use, okay, I'm making it complicated now. How would you use iTree to value what's already there?
So I think just from a planning context, we would only ever, and I think this is broader than Torbay. You're a consultee to the planning department, the relevant planning department, and your comments will be taken on board and considered along with everything, all the other bits of information they're getting. And essentially, your comments may be held in the planning balance depending on the needs of that particular area to provide housing. So ordinarily, if there's sufficient housing in an area and you've got a woodland next to it and there's an application in to remove half the trees to build some houses, then the expectation that it would be thrown out, there'd be no point. If you're absolutely crowded, we need to get the houses in, that's the highest priority, and we're going to have to say thanks very much, but we're going to lose a couple of trees. So the question there, I guess, is around the mitigation of what do we do and how far away from that area can we take the mitigation as well? Can we take it off site? I mean, we've got agreements in this country, section 106s, generally legal agreements with the developer saying, okay, you can't mitigate on site, we're going to take it off site in the public realm and do it somewhere else. So that's how you may be able to do it, assess it. Sometimes we can use what's Chris Nealon's?
CAVAT.
Yeah, CAVAT again, sorry. Yeah, through that so if we lose trees through infrastructure projects, we give them a CAVAT evaluation. So okay, if this is happening, because then sometimes in the planning circumstance, you've got to be relatively pragmatic. There will be loss at some point. As tree centric as we are, we can't hold on to absolutely everything as much as we want to. So okay, if you are going to take it out, then we want some money so we can do something with it elsewhere. So that's how we tend to offset what's going on if it is going to happen.
Yeah, it's tricky, and if it's okay, I wouldn't mind going back a little bit to, you made a comment about tree establishment.
Yeah,
and I personally wondered what the challenges are for you establishing trees. So I'm changing the topic now. Establishing trees in a coastal area. Is there anything specific there that like it's not as easy establishing trees on a coastal area where you've got salt laden winds. So did you have any tips or hints, or maybe some species you could sort of recommend for trees in coastal areas?
It is a difficult one. So I actually haven't planted directly adjacent to the coast, but if you take Torbay as the shoehorn, you've got Brixham, Paynton, and Torquay. And if you look at the treescape from the sea, which is in Torbay, the best way to do it if you ever get an opportunity, Brixham is devoid of trees around the harbour area. Up above, you'll have the odd lonesome pine and the dotted holm oak occasionally. Then you sweep round onto the coastal slopes, which are predominantly secondary woodland, so sycamore with an understory of holm oak growing up. And then you're into Paynton, which is absolutely, apart from Roundham Head, which has got some pines and some acers sat on there, generally in groups. So this is what we'll get into in a minute. The seafront at Paynton has got some very wind sculpted trees about 300 metres off the coast. They're all sat at that funny, peculiar angle.
Yeah,
where they've been absolutely battered. Yeah, and you sweep round into Torbay, slightly more sheltered, and we've actually got some success there with pines and acers again out on some headland tips. But again, group planted, so they've got that group companionship to offer them shelter. Well, they're actually going away quite happily. But in Torbay, whether it's the topography of the region, whether it's the way it's facing, which is due east, you've only got to go back 500 metres or so, and you can readily establish large canopy trees without too much help. You need that establishment phase, obviously, but you're not up against it in terms of the elements. It's really well sheltered from all other angles, so it's only when we get an easterly that the trees suffer. But yeah, beyond that, you just go back a little bit and we're into really good tree stock.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes,
Along the same, we've got a couple other questions here. One of them is for Dan. Torbay has done the first iTree in the UK and the second iTree in the UK. So what are you going to do next?
Well, roll on 2030, we might crack out the third one. So yeah, I mean, ideally that's what we'd be looking at long term, I guess, would be that, because then, if as selfish as it sounds, if we can build up that body of work over a number of years, and the slightly altruistic point around this is that there'll be work beyond me. So it's work beyond my predecessors that I'm doing, that I built on. Hopefully I can put the future in a good place with the work I'm doing, and then I'm probably still likely to be around in 2030, so I'll be here for that one, push that one through, and then just keep going. And you build up this body of work. So going back to the canopy cover piece, you can really then start looking over decades about how it waxes and wanes in certain areas, ward by ward, or by the whole area in total. So I mean, that's kind of,
it'll be great. The more that are done, like you say, going into the future, seeing the trajectory.
Massively so. You can see species that work, species that don't. You know, how are we doing? Where's the resilience? What's going on? It's data, isn't it?
Yeah, data driving.
Informed decision making.
Informed decisions. And again with the urban forest, it's all longer term stuff. I think we're very human centric, and we're thinking. The short timescales. Politicians thinking even shorter timescales of 5 years, which is even less helpful. And actually, tree time is like 70. You know, they manage the trees in Amsterdam on a 70-year rotation. You know, which is wow.
Exactly. It's a different space to be in. It's a different place in your head to be at, and just that understanding that what we're doing isn't. Well, it is for now as well, but certainly more for the future.
I'm looking forward. For anybody who's not from around Torbay, it is a place worth visiting. It's the English Riviera. So population increases by about 130.
Tourists. There's a baseline population of around 130 to 140,000, and that's certainly with visitor numbers throughout the summer can double.
It's got a fantastic treescape, and what's going to come onto is that there's the row going into Torbay. There's the Wellingtonias have been planted. They're young uns at the moment, but they're going to look fantastic.
So there's a little story around that. So when I started back in 1999, back with Torbay, before there was too much scrutiny, I guess, I did a little bit of stealth planting. So on that road as you come into Torbay, or Torquay on that one, was one of the main gateway roads in. there's a piece of land between the road and the railway, and it was all scrubbed up. We cut a line through the middle of it, and we actually planted up a row of sequoias back then. Didn't really tell anyone. I was only there for 18 months. I left and kind of forgot about them. And then they were refound by one of my successors in that role. So we cleared it all out, and then I think this was about 2010 actually, and planted some more to infill the gaps. So now on one side of the road, if you care to look, you've got 24-year-old Wellingtonias coming up, some 10-year-old Wellingtonias up, and now we've just planted down the left-hand side. So at some point in the future, 20, 30 years time, I'll literally take a drive down memory lane and have a look and see what they look like.
They're going to look fantastic in the future.
But they're well established, those newly planted ones.
Good legacy.
Yeah, very much so.
That's quite rewarding, being in the tree officer role, I guess, because it's been a long time since I've planted trees en masse, as it were, but being able to witness that legacy, the beginning of it anyway, is pretty cool.
Leave it behind. Yeah, it's good.
Any other questions, Dana?
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that sometimes we manage our urban forests for different things, right? So you have to manage it for tourists and tourism and make sure, that that's important. And one of the tools I think that iTree gives us is that opportunity when budgets are being cut or when there is no support for urban forestry to actually say, this is important to the people who come visit, and the people who come visit bring, dollars or, economic importance to our community. So we do always have to think about how we manage the urban forest for the different audiences. So there's a comment in here that's really great, and I don't think it's I think it's a subject of another webinar, but I'm going to just read this one, and then I think we'll wrap it up. It's to what do you put down successful, genuine commitment of the Torbay Council? Here in the Republic of Ireland, we're not political or bureaucratic. We have no commitment. How do you find passionate, ethically convicted public servants? And I think that's a really good, topic. But I think part of that is, in turning this back around, is how do you use the tools that we have? How do you use something like iTree? And how do you share the value of the urban forest with the people who are in charge of that? So I'm going to leave it at that and let you guys wrap this up a little bit here.
Did you want to speak a bit about it?
Yeah, so I think actually it stems from having those initial tools, and then there's obviously a passion that sits with the job. It's very much a vocation as opposed to a job, that there's a genuine professional interest in doing this. And if you convey that along with the data, along with an upswell of environmental awareness from the general population, which I think we actually have in Torbay in community groups, then it crosses all sorts of political boundaries, and it crosses political timeframes, and it's, again, being blunt, it's a win-win for everyone. Everyone can hang their hat on we're doing the right thing environmentally. So it's not pushing an open door, but if you open the door for them and say, look, we've got all this information around the tree population and our amenity spaces and our shrubs and our maritime seagrass.
Yeah.
Do you want to run with it? This is a win-win. You give me a bit of money and you get some kudos. So
yeah,
it's very much, so it can be politically incentivized like that, but it's just the way of the world in the local authority. So getting that backing, I think that was a load of work done by my predecessors again, I would imagine. I'm literally riding on the coattails here of all the work that's gone on before.
I mean, certainly I found, after hearing about iTree, I came back to the UK and I went to a conference to find out more, and actually I couldn't find out more about iTree because no one in the UK was using it or was aware of it. But I was in that conference and I spoke to Neil Coysh, who obviously he was in your role back then, and now he's moved up the chain looking after the natural environment. But I got that impression, that Torbay understood the wider urban forest and and wanted to do something good and positive and be a first. And then we gave a presentation to one of the local councillors. And again, I was amazed. He just went, yeah, do it, and left. And it kind of fell into our laps, really. But it's easy to think, oh, that was lucky. But actually, luck is often previous work gone before in laying the foundation.
Yeah, it's the prep.
And so in places where there doesn't seem to be much motivation for it, it just needs to start with a single step. I know of communities which have now got big projects rolling, but it started with a single tree and a single action. Maybe they used iTree to value one single tree and put a tag on the tree and invited the newspapers down and got that one photo, and that's what started it. But things won't happen overnight. They do take time. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Kenton, for this really informative conversation. And there's some great comments in the chat, but we need to wrap this up now. And I will say thank you so much. And I learned a lot, and I look forward to the opportunity to learn more from you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope everyone else has enjoyed it out there. Thanks for putting your faith in us to hopefully give you something informative and useful. And we'd do it again if you want that. Do another interview session. If we haven't answered all the questions that are in the chat, we can get those, and Dan and I will go through them and answer them, and then we'll make sure those get back to you as well. Thank you.
If you are interested in carrying out your own iTree survey and you would like to chat with us, do get in touch via our website. We're at treeconomics.co.uk. We've got some fantastic resources on there as well for anyone who's interested in finding out more. But before we go, Dana, could I ask you to share the iTree conference slide, please?
Yes, I think. Hang on.
Okay, so
there we go. Let me share my screen here.
We've got to talk about this because we've been talking about iTree for an hour, and we've got this fantastic event coming up this summer in Dundee, Scotland. So it's for anyone who's interested in getting data out of their urban forests. It's not all about iTree. It's about making change on the ground using data. There will be speakers from around Europe and the UK talking about how they've done that. And the following day, which is day 3, we will be hopping on a coach for a treescapes tour of Dundee, which is an optional bonus. So do visit our website for information about that. I've also put a link in the chat. There's also a link in the chat to our next webinar, which is all about the tree equity score tool. And we'll be doing a live demo of how to use that. It's for anyone who's interested in where the trees are in their towns and cities and how equitable the distribution is. Again, that's on our events page. So we'd love to see you there. And I think that's it. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Kenton. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you.
See you at the next one.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.